Yeah, I'm going to present a multi-level classification. This was developed out of some work that we did in the Northwest Territories, and we decided to take the classification and apply it elsewhere to see how it worked. And I wanted to acknowledge some really key people without which we couldn't have done this kind of work. Of course, the government of Alberta, they've supplied us with a lot of the LiDAR data that we're using. Linda Halsey, who did a wetland, kind of a delineated wetland map, Scott Brown, Elise Gabrielli, Tani Phillips, Kayla Noble, are all part of University of Waterloo, who have been working with Rich Patrone and I, and Kevin DeVito at the University of Alberta, and he's like the site PI for the area that we're looking at. So I kind of showed this at the same kind of meeting that we had last year, looking at LiDAR data and use of LiDAR data. And so I'm going to kind of repeat a little bit because things don't really change too much. Basically, we need an accurate classification in order to look at changes in land cover types. If we don't have an accurate classification, and we really don't know a baseline, or we don't have a baseline for how these things are changing. So these are very, very important with respect to climate change, disturbance, and so on. And I've just put up a fen that's south of Fort McMurray. Probably, it's probably in Peter's kind of polygon of where he's doing all his surveys. So that's kind of cool. And you can see that there's a whole lot of disturbance going on around that peatland there. So why are classifications important for quantifying landscape changes to ecosystems? And we probably all know this quite well. We need to do accurate change detection. It's very difficult. I know it's very difficult manually delineating land covers from old maps and old air photos. It's not very fun. Confusion matrices, when you look at confusion matrices in remote sensing software, really don't tell you anything about how accurate the classification is when you relate it to what's really going on in the environment. It's just kind of a confusion between pixels in the classification. We need improved accuracy of land surface classification for modeling. If we don't know the area of, or homogeneous area of what we're looking at, how can we properly model these things? And these are linked to land surface models, general circulation models, you know, all the way to something as large as like global greenhouse gas fluxes and so on. We want to quantify human disturbance, of course, by having a baseline. We can see how things are changing. We can start to understand things like reclamation. We can get into the monitoring framework, which is so important. And then finally, of course, policy and planning. So we want to look at functional assessments of wetlands. We want to plan for the future, and we want to look at contributions. And my main area of interest is greenhouse gas fluxes. So I'm constantly kind of going back to land surface models and greenhouse gas fluxes. So basically, without an accurate land cover classification, large uncertainties exist. So we want to get as good of a classification as possible. Now, Erin gave a really great overview of our site in the Northwest Territories, Scottie Creek. So I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but this is those photographs kind of show you what it looks like, and when we get to the edges of some of these plateaus here, this is a plateau edge, and then this is your bog here, we can start to see that the vegetation changes quite drastically. The trees start to tip over because they don't have purchase anymore, and everything starts to change, which exacerbates the thaw. So this is just the changes in the land, the change in permafrost area from 1947. Erin talked a bit about this, and I'll just try and show you this movie. These were from air photos from 1947 through to 2008. So the green areas are the permafrost areas, and the white areas is basically everything else, fens and bog and lake areas. So you can see quite a drastic change, and these were all manually outlined from air photos, so it took quite a long time. And with the change in the decrease in plateau area, we can see about an 8% increase in bog area from 1970 to 2008, and a 3% increase in fen area. So bogs are actually increasing in size faster than fens are, which could have significant greenhouse gas implications. If we look at total discharge from 1995 to the present time, we see an increase in discharge too, so we're seeing increased runoff. So when we compare classifications, we can do a bunch of different classifications. The one on the left is a fusion-based classification using airborne LiDAR and Worldview, and it works quite well when we compare it with our field data. If we just use Worldview alone, we don't get such a good classification. So the fusion method was 88 to 97% correct. When we compare it with our field data, I'm not saying that it's correct right across the whole watershed, but it matches up pretty good with our field data, and I've heard other people say, wow, I came to this bog and your classification said this was the edge of the bog, and it was, so that's kind of neat. The Worldview classification only had about a 38 to 74% accuracy, and of course we know that as we kind of increase in the spatial resolution, we don't necessarily get such accurate classifications either, because you've got a lot of speckle, which we went through and removed, but anyway, it's still problematic. But the interesting thing is our confusion matrix said it was 91% accurate. So if you're a hydrologist and you don't know much about remote sensing, and you say, oh, I did a land cover classification and wow, my confusion matrix says it's 91% accurate, that's fantastic, let's go and run all these hydrological models. You can actually, it is not necessarily representing reality. What we found was that when we used the Worldview and LiDAR fusion classification, we actually found that we could characterize between 82 and 96% of the land cover extents using LiDAR data alone. So this is vegetation structural characteristics. What is the tree height? What is the fractional cover? What does the understory look like? You know, are the trees spiky or rounded? What does the topography look like? What is the topographic position? So this is quite neat because, you know, if you're living in Alberta and you've got this wonderful large Alberta data set, you know, well, you don't need Worldview necessarily to do it. So, and Worldview is expensive. For this watershed, it was about $15,000. So if you can access LiDAR data, then that's really a great thing. So based on that idea that we could use LiDAR data on its own, we decided to basically apply the same classification to a boreal forest area in northern central Alberta within the western boreal plains. So we developed this LiDAR-based method for classifying wetlands and other land use types. We want to do a regional assessment. We haven't done that yet, but this is something that we need to do. And then we want to try to kind of make a decision criteria whereby, you know, if we were running this classification over large areas, can we use a method for saying, you know, if it meets this criteria, then use this mode of classification or these decisions. If it meets this criteria, then use these decisions. So we took that classification and then applied it to look at hummocks and hollows within a fen environment. So we could use it over a very, very small area or a much larger area. And then we validated our results. So just to introduce the main site that we looked at, the main site is this one right here. It's the Uticuma Regional Study Area. It's just north of Lake Uticuma. And we've got a really nice kind of remote sensing data coverage there. We've got 3 LiDAR data sets, including the one from the government of Alberta. Chris Hopkinson and I actually we surveyed ourselves 2 of the data sets. We acquired Worldview data in 2012, which wasn't very good because it was really hazy, unfortunately. GOI in 2009, this is for forest fire assessment. And then we also have more than 12 energy balance towers, covariance, hydrometric data collection, and so on. The second site is in the Fort McMurray area. We just looked at 3 fens. We've only just started looking at this, so it's kind of preliminary, but I'll show you what we've got there as well. So the idea is that we can look at the topographic position, the vegetation structure, the intensity, and the texture, and we can use these things and we can organize them to represent certain parts of the landscape. So each part of the landscape would have kind of a signature of characteristics that we can say, you know, this landscape is characteristic of these kind of attributes. So for example, uplands tended to have tall mixed wood forests of aspen and pine. They were located in upland areas. They tended to be fairly dry. You know, their texture is different from that of bogs. They're a little bit bumpier than bogs and so on. So we could use these several data streams or products to represent what we know as upland forests. So we're going to look at this kind of smaller area here, and this larger area is just kind of a larger subset of an even much larger area. So you can see these are kind of water areas here in white. Laser pulses you know, reflect completely off of water. It's like a mirror. We have this kind of geological formation here, and it's kind of a bit variable. So we started first with our LiDAR DEM, and we can take that LiDAR DEM and manipulate it how we want. So we gridded it using an inverse distance weighted with a 2-meter search radius to reduce the heterogeneity. And then we increased the search radius to basically normalize the data set. So we don't want to have any underlying slope. We want everything to be normalized to the same plane. And then we basically use a kind of an iterative search radius based on high points. So you window along and you select your high points, and then you can find your upland areas based on the quantile distribution of your heights above the surface. Does this correspond to uplands? Yes or no? And then we make the decision. In this case, it does. So then we say, you know, this will feed into the next data stream to create an upland, so the next decision criteria. So you can see all of our upland areas here in red. And if you kind of go back to the shaded relief model, you know, they fairly well correspond. It's a fairly simple way to extract those. We can then, based on these quantile distributions, look at mid-lying areas where, say, riparian vegetation might locate, and then low-lying areas. So this is where we'd have high soil moisture, more saturation, bogs, fens, and so on. And of course, we can combine it together. We can combine any of these layers. If we wanted just uplands characterized as one thing, and then kind of all low-lying areas characterized as another, we can combine them. So the blue areas are the low-lying areas, and the red areas are the higher areas. So we're basically building kind of like it's like a building block method for putting everything together. The next one is vegetation structures. So of course, we're really interested in vegetation height. If you go into these kind of upland areas, you see these tall trees. You go into riparian areas, they're shorter. The treed peatlands look very, very different from non-treed peatlands and so on. So we start to look at the maximum height distributions, and we use a digital surface model, subtract it from a digital elevation model, which Martin tells me he's got a way better method for doing that through LASS tools now, so maybe I'll try his method instead and see how it works. But you know, we're looking for changes in canopy height, and then we remove gaps and apply a low-pass filter, because we're not interested in the spaces between trees, we're interested in characterizing the landscape. So the other thing that was kind of useful was to look at the variance in the vegetation heights. So where we have areas that have very large differences in vegetation heights tended to be focused in forested areas, whereas places where we had small differences in vegetation variances or vegetation heights tended to be wetlands. And this kind of makes sense. If you go into a forest, the tree canopy kind of goes like this, so you see large variations. In a peatland, the vegetation is very, very short, so the variations aren't as great. So we can also characterize the structure of the landscape using that method as well as one of our inputs. And then we can classify based on the ranges fairly easily, and we can still, again, start to see our uplands, some of our uplands in blue, some of our riparian areas in green, and then these are some of our bogs, which have very short vegetation. So here's, this was taking the topographic location plus the tree vegetation structure. We can start to pull out things like riparian vegetation, tree peatlands in the darker green. It's a little bit harder to see, I think. Open peatlands in red, and then the blue would be the upland areas. Now, in some places, there's a bit of confusion. And well sites are a little bit confusing because they have the same characteristic as like a bog, except they're up in an upland, right? So there's this short vegetation, grassy vegetation, except that they're up in an upland area. So here is classified this well site as a peatland, but it's not actually a peatland, it's a well site. So then what the classification does is it takes kind of the layers, as if more kind of inputs relate to one type of thing than another, then it can correct all these things. So that this well site was then corrected, and it was made a well site or a reclamation site in the classification. So intensity is very useful for mapping soil saturation, especially if you have single returns that don't interact with any vegetation or canopy. In this case, for this very small area, I just used it for mapping the water. But of course, as you increase in scan angles and you increase in your area, you're going to get a lot of this specular reflection. So we're not going to see water as being black. It's going to look kind of white. Or we might have high intensity returns or no returns at all. So we have to adjust for that. But in this case, it worked fine for mapping water. So combined with a flat elevation, we can map the water surface with that. And it works fairly well. You can see some kind of areas in here surrounding some of these little ponds here and in here. And when we look at the Worldview data, that's actually just standing kind of aquatic vegetation that's coming up above the surface. So that's probably what that's related to. Okay, so this is the result of our classification just for this small area. It's 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. You can see the green areas are some of the uplands. We've got yellow is hard to see. These are these reclamation regeneration sites. So we've kind of combined well sites into areas that have been recently clear cut, because they look very much the same, and we just can't distinguish between them unless we start looking at shapes. But the classification works fairly well. Now, to validate the classification, what we did is we did a bunch of field work. Kayla Noble's been going out into the field and measuring trees along transects, and Rich has had a number of students go out there and do a bunch of field work. So we've got the field component covered, but we also wanted to look at it spatially as well. And Linda Halsey has delineated this massive great area of wetlands in Alberta using air photos, and that must have been an absolute job of work. I mean, I've only ever done it for a really small area, but she did it for a huge area, so kudos to her. But it's really useful because we can start to see how well our classification matches up with her manually delineated wetlands. So these are the manually delineated wetlands here in red, the red lines here, and then you can see the light, anything that's light green, which is treed peatlands, light brown, which are peatlands, and some of the riparian areas tend to fit quite nicely within those, within that manually delineated area. So when we look at the omission, commission, and correspondence of these areas spatially, correspondence is green, so this is where everything, both her classification and mine, match up perfectly. Omission is where hers classifies something as wetland, but mine doesn't. And then red is where mine classifies something as wetland, and hers doesn't. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at some of these areas here, we can see that mine classified these areas as wetland, but hers didn't. But if you really look at the topography of that area, they really probably likely are wetlands, and she might have just missed them. So I'll pick out kind of 3 areas that we can look at in more detail. The first one here, so she's kind of drawn a line along here, but this is obviously a wet area as well, and here too. Now, of course, the lake levels might have changed. This could have impacted things. But if we think that they're, coincident or the same, then there's some variability. Also up here, she hasn't delineated it. And right around here too. So if we look at the commission errors, we can see in some cases perhaps our classification does a better job than the manual delineation. Now there's still some errors in our classification. You can see kind of this upland area where ours kind of pushes into that, and perhaps along here. But in general, we're able to kind of identify those areas of wetlands that maybe she didn't identify. Same thing here. This looks quite a bit like a wetland to me, but she didn't identify it as such. And then this area here, same type of thing. And of course, you do see some kind of some errors in ours as well, but I would say that the errors are not too bad, considering it's a fully automated classification. So because it's a decision-making classification, we can make decisions based on the roughness of the surface. So we can use the same methodology, for example, for identifying things like hummocks and hollows within an individual fen. And this is a really neat fen that we looked at just near Fort McMurray, and you can see the green areas are little hummocks within the fen. The blue areas are little hollows where we'd have increased soil moisture in different species, vegetation species types. And then we've got these black areas are saturated. So it's using the same methodology. If we look at the Worldview data, this is just Worldview that we kind of differentiated for just the hollow areas. And you can see kind of a nice range in spectral characteristics throughout the whole fen here. And these little dots here, For every single dot, there's a number of measurements of species, measurements being taken at each place within a hummock and a hollow, so they're very localized. And so then what we could do is we could characterize the species types based on whether they were located in a hummock or a hollow, and their mixtures. And we basically took the spectral characteristics within plots, a few plots, did the classification, the spectral classification, and then validated it. But it's kind of a preliminary bit of work that we still need to work on and validate further, because I'm not sure, we can say that it's fairly good according to our plots, but we need more plots. Hummocks and hollow classification was approximately 87% correct according to our GPS data. The spectral hummock and hollow classification for species types was 60% correct. If we take the next pixel over, which is I think within like a meter over, is 26% correct, an additional 26% correct, but again, we have to do more validation. So in conclusion, just to tell you a little more about Scottie, when we do spectral classification using Worldview alone, we found that the plateaus were 2 times greater in area than if we used a decision tree classifier. And this can have significant impacts to water resources because we're overestimating thaw-related discharge from those permafrost plateaus. So we need to be very careful about that. In the Western Boreal Plain, we found that our classification methods were able to effectively and quite easily characterize the land cover types, including wetlands and wet areas. And it certainly is faster than other methods once we have all the data products that we need to derive, and that's also kind of time consuming. But it's certainly faster than manual delineation from air photos. It uses LiDAR data only, which is great for the province of Alberta because we've got this wonderful data set. And the methods could be variably scaled.